I mean, I think it's a combination of everything. It's a combination. There would certainly be EQ of that captain, and not so much EQ. Maybe it's partly EQ, but it's really understanding his individual player, and so that would have been the captain. I mean, but just was what coaches are important of. I mean, and I think understanding each individual player is probably what is critical. What buttons can you push with each player? How far can you push each player? Some people you might not have been able to do that with. And that is something that we address quite a lot, is that coaching has moved a lot from being, we coach in one way, our whole team. But we need to now coach each individual player. And yeah, at under 10 level, it's fine to coach everyone the same way. But as you start getting older, because people respond psychologically differently, mentally, but even physically, obviously, and even towards injuries, everyone responds differently. And it's understanding your player would have been important.
Absolutely critical. I've heard that so often, and in fact, as a physio, when I'm treating an injury, I spend a lot of time dealing with those psychological fallouts, and they really they're profound, particularly in elite sport. And I think there has to be processes put in place where a coach checks in regularly with a player. Sometimes players will say, "Well, I've been out for a month," and the coach hasn't phoned me once. And that again, I suppose, comes to emotional intelligence. But not only is that important for like a sense of belonging still in the side, even though you're not able to participate, it actually becomes really important in recovery, because there's a lot of talk now about optimism and the way you feel about your recovery from injury actually influencing the recovery of the injury itself. So it's not only just an emotional component, it becomes physical too. So, and a coach plays a huge role, and it's also a captain, to reach out as one of the players to that injured person, particularly with significant or what we call catastrophic injuries, when you're out for a long period of time. Critical. I think that's an excellent question.
I think, sorry, if I can just add, I think a lot of it, we've learned a lot from COVID and how people feel excluded from a group or an environment through COVID. And I think a big part of sport, especially in the junior ranges, so, from 18 years and younger, there's a huge social dynamic which we need to bring into place. And I know a lot of the areas or the clubs around us, if a person is injured and they're particularly out for a long period of time, they almost get managerial duties, or they do some game analysis, so that they still feel like they're part of the process, and they still feel like they're contributing. And I think that's what COVID is, I've realized with some of the individuals that I'm dealing with at the moment, is that you realize that lack of connection, that lack of communication is vital. And if you can just pull them back in by giving them jobs to do or assisting you in the coaching, I think that's a strategy that will potentially help with that sudden loss.
Yeah, I think because also what happens is they end up missing out, especially if it's a long-term injury. The team is actually moving on. Some of their tactics their tactics are becoming different. And so if you haven't been part of sort of the team, even a team talk, you lose out. So you almost come back on the back foot as well.
Players are going to hide things. They're going to hide things from the coach, and they need to find somebody to trust and be able to be honest with. It would be great if that could be the coach, and I think there are a number of coaches that are actually stepping up to that, and people are able to be honest about injuries. But I think, yeah, absolutely being able to touch base and express. One of the talks I give on the fear of injury is, when I'm looking to a patient going back, I always say, okay, what is your pain out of 10? I mean, that VAS analog scale has been used extensively. But actually what I use for return to play more is, how confident do you feel in your shoulder, your knee? Are you scared of going back? And sort of that fear element becomes really important in return to play. But you've got to have a relationship with the player for them to be able to be honest about that.
I think you've got to manage it in terms of, firstly, injuries are part of sport, and it's about looking at that. All it is a setback. it's not, you've got to put it in perspective. And it's not about it's not the end of their sporting career. So it's looking at the bigger picture and saying that just because you've got injured now doesn't mean you're not going to be able to ever play again. So that's really important. I think it also comes to understanding the player, and this is where we often have a problem with youngsters whose sport is their identity. And if your sport is your identity, then you're dealing with that injury is more difficult, because then you think, yeah, well, I've got nothing, I've got nothing to live for because all I can do is sport. But actually at 12 years of age, there's a lot more, and it's really about looking after the whole person and identifying other things that they can be doing whilst they recover from the injury, and just putting it all into perspective. I think is probably some of the most important, without, again, you'd look at each individual person, but just from a generic is helping put things into perspective.
I know one of the strategies that we use with, Andrew does a lot of the rehabilitation of our youngsters that we see, and he puts them into groups. So even if they're not exactly the same injury, there's a group of young boys, and somebody might be a little bit further down in the injury recovery, and they support each other, and they find an environment where they're with like-minded people. They're missing their sport, they love it, they want to get back, but they get support from each other. And I think I would always encourage parents who've got a youngster who's is injured, is to put him into a situation like that where he can actually be with other boys, and it doesn't even have to be the same age. Sometimes the boys are a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old, and it's amazing how the 16-year-old steps up and looks after the 12-year-old, and then they're both are fulfilled, and they've learned life lessons. So those kind of special nuances, and a coach, the role that a coach plays there is to find that situation, to find that practice around them that does that kind of thing, and engage in that process. I've written 2 articles, one on Sever's disease, which is the ankle injury, and one on Osgood-Schlatter's, which is the knee injury, and they're growth-related injuries. And they're called self-limiting injuries. So there's not a whole lot you can do to prevent them. They do happen in youngsters that participate a lot in sport. So they've actually done a study that found that in kids that specialize early, which is one of the things we're trying to move away from a little bit, there's a greater incidence of Sever's disease, for instance. So, sorry, that was Osgood-Schlatter's, the knee problem. So there are definitely injuries that are specific to different times of growth. And, there it would be lovely to get involved in a school. We work with some of the schools and actually provide stretching programs, because in growth, one of the things that happens is skeletal growth outruns, or skeletal growth happens faster than muscle growth. So they'll end up getting these very tight tissues which pull on the tendons, which actually cause these traction injuries. So you could actually get, if a school had a biokineticist involved, or they brought one in for a general screening and stretching program, that could happen. But there are lots of those kind of injuries. Stress fractures, classically, we used to say their onset was 14. We're now seeing them in 10 to 12-year-olds, but I think that's because of puberty happening earlier, but also specialization and too much bowling and cricket happening too young. So there are a number of injuries where that is the case.
I think it's a very simple thing that the coach can do. It's just measure height and weight. And it's funny, it's one of the simplest measures to do. So if you want to understand whether your player is at risk of getting any of these developmental injuries, just measure height and weight. And if they've suddenly grown up, or grown an inch or grown 2 inches since the last month's weigh-in or the last month's check, you can then be assured that they're at risk. And I think that's the important thing. And I think, as Janine said in her talk, it's not to turn your eye against the injury, it's rather just to try and engage it. And it's a very simple tool, a height and weight measure. It's once a month, you get everybody in there. And I think as a coach, you'd be a hell of a surprised as to how they change and how quickly these young kids develop and grow. And you just know that they are generally at risk. So when when the player comes to you and they complain about a sore knee, you know they're not faking it. And you've got the emotional intelligence to then say to them, okay, we've got to pull back on your practices. We just don't want you to, because he's just susceptible at that stage.
It's again on the tissues. Like if you've got a tendon and you're giving it a cortisone injection, like that's a nightmare, because you're actually just going to be making the injury worse long term. You know, there's some joints that you can inject once, like the shoulder, if somebody's got an impingement, if there is a very important event coming up and that player is particularly relevant. There are certain times where perhaps a cortisone injection may just allow them to play, but you pay a price for that. And that's where you need to have a coach that is very emotionally intelligent, a kid that or a sportsman who has some degree of understanding. And the one thing, and it's an area Marianne's very involved in, is parents with emotional intelligence. So like if you've got a youngster who's potentially going to ruin their adult life of participating in sports, they need to be able to engage way up the negative and the positive effects.
I think the key thing here is to look at it like a balance. It's the immediate reward, conversely with the long-term concern that you've got. And to me, the risk here far outweighs the reward. Unless, of course, you're in a World Cups final or you're playing in the absolute, you know what I mean? That to me is the only time when I would ever think to advocate. But at a high school level, a junior level sport, I don't think there's one situation where I would ever advocate that a young athlete has a cortisone injection in order to participate.
Well, certainly not a young athlete, yeah. You know, they also change the way they play. It changes their biomechanics, and it often affects their performance. So I've seen a number of players be put on anti-inflammatories to get through a tournament, and they've just not performed. So they've actually, it hasn't done them any favors, because then, you know, the coaches are looking at them, they think, well, they're not performing, but they're not performing because they actually are taking medication to mask an injury. So I think you've really got to weigh up, particularly as a coach, like, is it worth having somebody who's half performing versus bringing up somebody who can come in at 100%?
Yeah, so I mean, also certainly at school level, it also gives an opportunity to someone else, which is what you're also trying to do. You're sort of developing a bit of another benefit. You would be developing a bit more depth in your team, so that actually you're not always completely reliant on the same sort of 15 players in that. And I'm not saying, you know, you're going to kick the person out, but it gives you an opportunity to give, certainly at high school, you know, at school level.
I don't know if I can be politically correct in answering this question. I would just say I don't think any athlete wants to peak at high school. I think that's not the aim. And I think there was a question that came up in the chat I saw earlier about, you know, an attrition in girls' sports. There's a lot of attrition rate. And I think what we're doing here is we've got to look at the bigger picture. We've got to say school sport is important, yes, but exercising, getting kids to understand the importance and the benefits of exercise, in my opinion, far outweigh the long-term benefit for what exercise and sport can ultimately do. So, I mean, most of the schools have high-performance centers. They all talk about it, but to me, when we look at it from a performance perspective, you see very few of those people that play first-team sport go on to play club sport, and or even play professional sport. Sorry, I'm going to mention Gary Kirsten. I know he gives a wonderful talk, and he tells all the parents in the talk to stand up, and you sit down if you ever participated in any representative sport. And of course, at the end of this, everyone's sitting down. He's standing up because he says, okay, so there's only one person that's represented their country in a sport here, and that's obviously him. And I think that the analogy that he gives is incredibly strong, because we have these ideals as parents that we want our school kids to be elite sportsmen. The reality is they love sport at high school, but there's very little flow on. And to me, especially in South Africa, it's one of the reasons why we have such a big attritional rate, is because we focus on the outcome far too early. New Zealand doesn't have this. New Zealand, as a rugby nation, they get bigger numbers as you get higher up. So when you look at sort of high school level and then into club rugby far exceeds the number of high school rugby sides. If you look at it in South Africa, it's totally the opposite. So our numbers in primary school are as big as they're ever going to get. In high school, they get less. And in club, I mean, that's why our club system is really struggling. Because I think our high schools are focusing too much on the performance aspect and on that first team.
But I think I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because the difficult part, while that might be our feeling, is that if one school has a high performance center and is pushing it, and players get into provincial teams, it's really difficult to get into any form of provincial or representative teams the older you get. And it probably is, we need to look at those systems and revisit them, because I think that is a big problem. So that's why kids are specializing early, because you want to make that under 13 provincial team, because if you don't make that team, to get in at under 15 is really difficult, and under 19 is virtually impossible. So that is one of the reasons I think why schools and kids and parents are pushing, is because I think that whole system of trying to go professional or to try and take your sport as far as you can is quite flawed. So I think it needs a whole rework by like sporting bodies. And then I think a number of schools are trying to look at it and trying to balance it. And if they have a multi-sport athlete or an athlete that is in a number of different sports or different levels of games, so first team and provincial and wada, that they are trying to protect those athletes. And that's sort of something we are trying to get a lot more involved in, is trying to protect those athletes. You know, make sure that they're not overtrained, not overreaching, and going to get that catastrophic injury that rules them out. So I think if schools are going to persist with those high performance, and I don't see anybody putting aside like their first team rugby squad and trying to get them to do as best as they can, we just need to make sure that the protection and the preventative measures are there to try and protect the athletes.
And I think it's difficult. It's a very difficult question to try and answer, and I think the medical sciences are really giving it a good bash in terms of trying to identify all those aspects. But I think for this conversation, just to understand that it's very much an individual thing. It's age dependent, it's gender specific, it's related to how much sleep you've had. It changes on a day-to-day basis. You know, so it's very difficult to quantify and give you a number, or give you, you know, you run 10 Ks in a week, or you're overtrained, or you throw 40,000 balls, you're overdone. It's very, very difficult to do that. But it is something, and I think in Janine's talk, she would have mentioned a lot of that, is that we've got to look at it from an individual basis. And we've got to consider load, because again, what we've done is we've swung, this pendulum has swung from, we have this fear of too much load, and too much load creates injury, but we've swung the other way and there's not enough load. So we're going to get injured in any case. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And I think, unfortunately, the sweet spot is dependent on a number of factors. And again, I would go back to the coaches. The coaches are the people that are most in the best position to make decisions on that, because they know their players better than anything else. They can see when they're lethargic. They can see when they're tired. Yes, we've got simple measures. You know, there's simple measures about heart rates, and you know, so there's some quite easy objective measures that we can do and we can take. But the reality is, the coach, if he's really in tune with that player and he understands that player and he's been watching, he can understand different movements, how he works, how much energy he has, how he's talking back, etc., etc. So unfortunately, I think it's going to fall back into the hands of the coach to say, well, there's all this information, but at this level, I've got to deal with one player at a time.
One of the things that I often say to coaches, particularly high school coaches, because if they've got a good player, he's often playing provincial sport as well. So his load is huge. And I think what happens sometimes is, well, the school coach and the provincial coach are often at loggerheads, because, well, it's the big derby game on the weekend. So, you know, let's pull back on provincial, but the provincial coach has got his own issues. So I think what is really important is that whatever team you're coaching, whether you're a high school of the under 16A team and you've got somebody who's playing provincial sport, look at his load. Understand how many times he's going to practice. Understand if he's training with a biokinetist at the same time and going to gym and doing provincial load, and understand everybody's load. And that's where I talk about accountability. You know, like I think we often say, well, it should be the provincial coach's responsibility. If he's not taking responsibility as the high school coach, you need to. So those are simple ways that you can start to address it.
And I think that also a lot of it comes to the communications between the different and engaging with the different coaches. So I mean, some players may have 3 or 4 coaches. They've got private coaches and they've got, you know, school, provincial, etc. So it's about someone taking that accountability and communicating with the player, and communicating obviously at school level with the parents involved as well. So it's about the education and communication.
I do also think that as a collective, as a coaching body, we've also got to be better, because you can't just go to practice. Each practice needs to have a focus, and I think that's something that we would be better at, and we would find this overtraining wouldn't exist to the same extent if we understood that this is not just a practice session and we weren't just going to practice 3 times a week. There's a technical practice, there's a game-based practice. You know, if we could start identifying what the metabolic aim of each practice was, you would then see that there'd be some practices which were really intense, other practices which are more technical and patterns played. So I think it becomes important for the fraternity of coaches to also look at that and say, geez, we've got a huge role to play in that. Because if you are going high, low days or technical days, you negate the fact, to a large extent, you will negate a lot of those concerns that we have about just the load, because the load becomes a problem, because every time you go to practice, everybody's trying to get the maximum out of that particular player.
One of the brilliant examples of this, and I mean, I suppose it's a whole talk on its own, but in the last few years, intensity of practice has become, that's the buzzword. You know, you've got to be as close to match play intensity at practice and stuff. So what they've done is they used to have a 2-hour soccer practice. They've now realized intensity has to be greater, but they haven't dropped the duration. So they now have upped the intensity, but they still practice for 2 hours. That increases your load substantially. So if you have a high intensity practice, drop the duration. So there are really clever ways that you can adapt that and be more specific and prevent overtraining. Look, there are like, I know it's that hyperbaric chamber, and they've all the, you know, you'll have a sportsman who breaks a finger and goes and does that. I don't think there is substantial evidence or sufficient evidence to support that. And the one thing I would not want to do is hurry a bone healing, because it heals in 2 phases. So you want union to happen, and particularly in the lower limb, that happens in 6 weeks, but it takes 12 weeks for the bone to consolidate and be healed. And the good thing about a broken bone is that it can heal 100%. Ligaments, not so much. Muscles, not so much. They never get back to 100%. So I do think those timelines we need to stick to.
Yeah, I want to add to that and say that very often, if you've broken an arm, there's nothing wrong with your legs. And I think so. What happens here is we take the 4 or the 8 weeks off and we allow the bone to heal, but we haven't done any other conditioning in that time. And I'm not suggesting if you're a soccer player that you go and put your hand in a sling and you go and play soccer, but you can get onto a bicycle, you can do some home-based exercises. So you can keep a certain amount of your conditioning up, because very often that's the thing that holds you back when you're returning back to sport. It's not your broken bone, especially if you're looking at an arm as an example. So I think where we can cut off time is if we're thinking a little bit cleverly about if I've broken my arm, can I do my legs? Can I train my legs? Can I keep conditioned? Can I get into a swimming pool? You know, what are those activities that I can do that keep me conditioned so that when my arm is healed, the process is much easier to get into?